Okay, good afternoon, members. Welcome to the Budget and Performance Committee. Item 1 on today's agenda is apologies for absence and Chairman's announcements. I've had apologies from Assemblymember Desai, for whom Assemblymember Navin Shah is substituting, so welcome to the meeting, Navin. Thank you for coming. I have no other apologies, and we seem to be all present and correct. Item 2 is the declarations of interest. Are there any additional declarations to those in the papers that members wish to make at this time? No. Thank you, members. Item 3 is the summary list of actions. Can we note the report?
Noted.
Okay, the first substantive item of business for today is to look at the LLDC's draft budget. So I'd like to welcome our guests from left to right as I'm looking at it. Gerry Murphy, the Executive Director of Finance, Commercial and Corporate Services at the LLDC. Lynn Garner, I was going to say new Chief Executive, but you've been there nearly a year now, so not quite so new. But this is your first time doing this, so welcome to you, Lynn. And David Gallie, our mainstay, who is the Assistant Director of Group Finance at the GLA. Welcome to all of you. So the first question, traditionally, falls to me as the Chairman, and probably directed at you, Lynn, is the scene-setting question. So what does this budget do for the LLDC, and where is the organisation heading?
Good question, Chair. And just on that, it might be useful if I run through where we've been since we last met you and last talked about the financing for LLDC, which will cover off the scene setting and where we're headed and so on. Of course, we came in September to see you at the end of September. The park continues to see inward investment into Stratford and the Olympic Park itself, and most recently UNICEF moved their head office into the International Quarter. East Bank enabling works have started on site. Planning application is lodged, and we expect a determination in May with a full start on site for those buildings in June next year following the planning permission. East Bank is a £1.1 billion investment. As you know, I'm sure we'll be talking about it whilst we examine the budget. It's the single biggest investment in London in arts, culture and education since the Great Exhibition. 2 weeks ago, our director, Rosanna Laws, was here for a session with the committee that I understand went quite well with some East Bank partners, met some members of the Assembly. And it's a very exciting development, not without its challenges, but clearly extremely positive. On the stadium, since we met you last, I think our relationship with West Ham has continued to improve. We've now reached agreement on various things: pitch surrounds, honours boards, statues, stand naming, this, that and the other, in a package of developments in the stadium with Baroness Brady that is really positive. And you'll know that we've secured a settlement on the seating capacity dispute that we were due in court on the 19th of November, all of which is good. We announced yesterday we're about to sign a deal with UK Athletics on some further flexibility around the athletics window, which means that it will release some commerciality for E20 as far as the stadium's concerned. And we have Major League Baseball last year, which I'm pleased to say has sold out completely. All 57,000 seats sold out within 1 hour. We listened to your comments last time. Gerry, the Director of Finance, and with her Director of Finance hat on, sat down with Baroness Brady to look at matchday costs and can update on the conversations that took place there. And we will be, early in 2019, bringing a new focus to the stadium costs and looking at those on a line-by-line basis. In our budget submission, we set out how we continue to support mayoral priorities in this year, continuing with phase 2 of Chobham Manor, and starting on site with Stratford Waterfront, as I've mentioned. As you know, we have a particular financing model at LLDC. The GLA puts upfront investment into our work. And as I said last time I was before you, we are expecting by the mid-2030s to be making an annual return of around £200 million in business rates and council tax as a result of the regenerative impacts that we are making into the park. So strategy is going well, Chair. Still lots to do, particularly in terms of financing around the stadium and so on. But things moving ahead in a way I would expect, and I'm pleased with the progress.
Okay, thank you for that. I think most of what you've touched on is we're going to be going into in a bit of a deeper dive in some of the set areas of questioning that we've got. So I'm not going to ask you any supplementaries. I'm going to go straight into that, I think. So the first area we're going to look at is your revenue budgets, and the
Yes.
member Pedro is going to lead on that first.
So, Lynn, Gerry, are we any closer to this long-term goal of no longer needing the LLDC to run the park?
Oh, the transition.
Transition.
Yes. So one of my objectives when I joined the LLDC was to have a look at transition. Peter Henry asked me specifically to bring something by the end of the calendar year to the LLDC board. The team and I have done some work on that. We now have a high-level transition planning document that sets out a framework for change. What it does is it looks at a high level all of the different activities and complexities of the business, the things that we get involved in, from estate management on the park, running each of the venues, looking after the subsidies, collecting the fixed estate charge, developing things and so on, and sets all of those responsibilities out and starts to have a look at where we might set some work streams up in partnership with others, stakeholders on the park and the boroughs, to work through change over the coming years. High-level estimates for the transition in my head would be 5 to 8 years at this stage, depending on how we work through the detail. Planning powers, so one headline would be the next local plan, strategic development plan for the area, is due to be delivered in 2025. It's highly unlikely that LLDC will be producing that plan. So we've just done a local plan review for 2019. It's going into examination in public in 2019. It's adopted in 2020 fully. We won't be doing another one of those. So sometime between those periods, we'll be transitioning into borough activity for strategic planning. So we have a high-level idea. We're due to produce a more detailed strategy for our board next summer.
That's very helpful. So you could see things like planning functions going back to the boroughs a lot earlier, but there will potentially still need to be an organisation to manage things, as you say, like the collection of the estate fees.
I mean, our view at the moment, there's quite a lot of complexities in it, and so our view at the moment is you probably won't be faced with a situation where you can get rid of the thing altogether. If we want to keep the park together as a single entity and protect the legacy into the future, there'll need to be a successor body of some sort that is left behind. And the task will be working out who is that, who's part of it, what is the governance, how can we keep that as slim as possible so it's not costly, and how do we involve the partners in coming up with a successor body model that sort of works for everybody, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Okay, that's good to hear. It's the first time I think that's something I've heard, that you've got this clear plan going forward. Looking at your revenue budget, in terms of savings, I think you made almost 5 million in the last year, but in your budget going forward, you're looking at 621,000. Why are the savings slowing down so much?
Well, I think we have, as you reflect, we have made significant savings over the past few years, but we do have a limited cost base, and I think the slowdown in savings is reflected in that. Where we try and do more with less, actually, a lot of that over the past few years has come from event income. And of course, as the park gets developed, as Lynn discussed, East Bank is now hoarded. The Stratford waterfront site is now hoarded. We can no longer use that for events. The South Park site, where UCL will start work next year, that will soon be out of commission, and Eastwick and Sweetwater. So a lot of sort of our event opportunities, if you like, are narrowing. We've also on our trading accounts, if you like, we've got some challenges coming up. We've got works coming up at 3 Mills, so that will take out some of that capacity. And our off-park properties at Hackney Wick will also, they're now actually going to cost us probably in voids because they're coming out of rental commission while that's going into development. So we've got a lot of sort of challenges on that side, where previously we had been able to garner more income. And I think that although although there's a dip, actually it's quite a sort of an up and down profile over the next four years, but we are projecting around 4 million over the next 4 years. We do have budget gaps at the tail end of the budget period to address, so we will need to start looking in earnest now in the new year at how we do manage that. We've managed a sort of a funding gap situation for the last few years relatively successfully, in being a little bit better at bringing in a little more income and reducing our costs. But my concern is that actually our room for manoeuvre there is narrowing, and therefore we will need to look at how we can address those budget gaps in a different way.
So the budget gap's coming up. So my note says 2.4 million in the year 21-22 and 1.3 million in the year 22-23. So what sort of things are you going to look at to try to close the gap?
I think we have to look across all of our cost lines, but I think we also have to look at whether there are additional income lines that we can generate, because if I'm honest, that's where I think we have more opportunity. We do have a relatively small cost base in terms of flexibility. We've taken out significant savings out of our park facilities management costs. We've improved things like the subsidies on the aquatic centre significantly by looking at utilities, and I think we're going to have to look at income streams probably more fruitfully than costs, but not ignoring the cost base.
What work are you doing with Lee Valley Regional Park Authority? I know I've raised this with Lynn before at the plenary, in terms of grounds maintenance and other contracts that you might be able to share to save some costs, but also looking at how you can put a package together to get people interested in coming to the park.
So in terms of facilities management, we have 5 years left to run on our existing park facilities management contract. But I think both the stadium being fully in LLDC's control as well as LVRPA would offer opportunities.
So there's some potential there.
Potentially, forward. Yeah. I think LVRPA operate quite a different model, but actually on the park there may well be opportunities, and we do work with them. For example, on the new high ropes attraction, we're working with them.
So how can we get more visitors into the park to spend money to help? I don't know if Lynn, have you been having chats?
I think there are two things we need to look at proactively. One is, as you say, more of the joining up around the estates management. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? If you've got two sets of contractors, as we do at the moment. They don't do it themselves, they contract it out. So the obvious point is, when we're going to recontract, that we do that together, potentially. So we need to look at that. And that's also relevant, I think, to transition and who looks after the park in the long term. And that's not an easy conversation, because not everybody is supportive of Lee Valley Regional Park in terms of their position across London. However, they are there on the park. They own a really big chunk of land. And so therefore it makes perfect sense to have a look at that. And I think there'd have to be a very good business case not to join that up if we were to reject that way of looking at efficiencies. The second one really is, and I mentioned this a little bit at the plenary in September, is trying to do some cleverer things with the venues. So at the moment the venues are managed by separate organisations. In fact, they are just about to procure a new venue operator for hockey, tennis and velodrome, and indeed their facilities up in the valley. And there must be opportunities to join up, whether it's ticketing, you know, being able to promote the venues in a more joined up way to get families to come to the park and so on. So that's another opportunity we could look at. And then thirdly, I think there may well be sponsoring and marketing, sponsorship and marketing opportunities that we've not yet exploited either. So I think, there's lots to talk about. Sean and I have a good relationship. So I knew him before because I was working in Haringey in the Lee Valley, and we've met twice since I started this job. And in particular, more recently around the contracts associated with the venues, the ones he's just about to let. So they'll have a new venue operator this October, next October.
Very good. That sounds really promising, and I'm glad those conversations are now taking place. One of the other areas you've already mentioned is your fixed estate charge. Is it going to rise in line with your expectations, and is it going to be enough to cover costs?
So if I take rising in line with expectations, I think we wrote to you at the beginning of the year and set out the very long-term trajectory for the fixed estate charge, and we're content. We revisited that analysis over the budget period, and we're content we're on track. So in 18-19, we budgeted 1.8 million for fixed estate charge, and we've brought in marginally over that. It goes up to 2.1, 2.2 next year, and by the end of the budget period, it's 2.9. Although the further out, the more risk there is, because it depends on development delivering residential. So in 10 years' time, we expect it to be about 9 million. I think that's broadly in line with where we were. In 10 years' time, as Lynn's referred to, the sort of transition strategy, the shape of the organisation is going to be very different. Whether those two match up is difficult at the moment, but we have a lot of work to deliver in the interim in terms of delivering all of the housing, the East Bank, and also getting the stadium onto a better footing, because that is that is a big factor in the transition.
Okay,
So I think yes. Sorry, in short.
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to move on and talk about capital and borrowing, obviously a key thing for the LLDC, and Assemblymember Cooper's leading on that.
Thanks, Chair. So last year there was a bit of a change because a cap was introduced in terms of the loans from the GLA of 520 million, and there was an estimate of how much money was going to come to you in terms of the grant. And my understanding is that the direct grant is actually now estimated to be going up by another 21 million. And obviously at the beginning, you were setting out for us, Lynn, where we would be in the future in terms of the favourable financial position. You referred to Chobham Manor. Given that that's been brought forward, what's happened here, and why is the direct capital grant going up despite that coming forward?
I think, Gerry, can you talk to the 21 million?
I can. So as you reflect, during last year's budget process, we agreed with the GLA that we would cap borrowings at 520 million, and for any borrowings over that sum, it would be funded by direct grant. Our borrowings profile moves around. It does change, and to a large extent that explains some of the difference. I expect it will continue to change over time, as it does with large capital projects and large revenue receipts from development. So the phasing is a substantial part of that. So the revenue cap really clocks in, I think, in about 21, 22. So I would expect to see continued change in that over time as our borrowings, as our spend profile and revenue profile changes.
Does that mean that the 21 is accounted for because the profiling has changed as opposed to...
Yes,
right.
but it is current forecast of borrowings over cap.
Except they're not borrowings, are they? It's actually it's a grant.
Translated into grant. So
Okay.
Borrowings over the cap translated.
Okay,
into
so
grant.
I'm still completely unclear as to why that amount has gone up. Bearing in mind it is a grant, and therefore is not something that you would be. You're not borrowing it and planning to return it. So I think we do need to nail down why it has increased. Because obviously that money is then not available for other things that the GLA is doing. You're not the only budget cost centre, if you like, that we're looking at. Some of the other cost centres are, of course, considerably larger. But I think, we need to know and also the 520 million that you're borrowing from the GLA is also then not available for other projects. David, can you help us on why these changes have taken place and what the implications are?
So just to reiterate, the 520 remains the GLA's borrowing cap. That's the amount we've determined we can go up to as a maximum. A year ago, there was then an estimate of the spend that's required above the 520 cap, and that spend will obviously vary as information comes in, things change, profiles change. So the increase in grant, I think, as has been said, would reflect a reprofiling of spend fundamentally, rather than any additional commitments that have been entered into.
So you're suggesting then that it could be reprofiled again. So it might be 21 million now above the figure that we've agreed that we're just going to give. That's my understanding. It's a grant that we're giving. Or are you suggesting that the reprofiling also includes paying any of it back?
The 520 remains the cap.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about above the 520.
The 520 then becomes the basis on which that sum will be repaid. But inevitably, as things are developed, those costs above the 520 cap will vary and change as contracts are let, as development takes place, as things slip or things move forward.
So it might come down?
It might come down.
So you might be repaying some of the grant?
The grant required might come down. It's an amalgam of a number of income lines and a number of expenditure lines across all of our programmes. So it's difficult to pinpoint. Well, we can try and do the analysis, but it's difficult to pinpoint one particular item. But the cumulative borrowings have moved, and the grant is a figure that drops out of it, but it will continue to move.
So you're saying it's moved and it's changed, it's been reprofiled, it might move and change again.
It undoubtedly will.
And are you able to then explain to me why that is, why it's gone up at this point in time?
I would need to go back and do an analysis of all of the movements, of which there are many.
Okay, because we've had discussions with other people about other money in their capital and revenue budgets, and they have been able to tell us. And I think maybe, Chair, then we can expect some more detail from you. We'll
pick it up in the
have a sort of wash up at the end. Well, I was also going to ask you how long it's going to be until the £520 million is going to be paid back, and of course this is money that is interest free, and I'm hoping you're going to be able to give me a slightly clearer answer in terms of the time that might take for it to be returned.
Current projections are that borrowings begin to be repaid in the mid-2020s, but are not finally repaid until the mid-2050s.
And do you presumably have a projection for paying that off?
Yeah.
Working forward from the mid-2020s onwards?
Yeah.
Perhaps we could also be provided with that then. Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Question for you, David, before we move off this section. Does the GLA borrow to grant fund the LLDC?
We actually haven't marginally borrowed above what we otherwise would have done for LLDC. Effectively, we've been using our strong cash flow as a means of paying LLDC. But obviously, it's early days on the 520. Yeah. As and when the spend really begins to take off, then we'll need potentially then to go to PWLB and borrow from them to service that debt. But at the moment, we haven't taken any additional borrowing ourselves. And it's perhaps it's important just to clarify one of the issues that Leonie raised. There is actually a very clear interest payment. This is not a there's no lack of transparency about the interest payment here. There's clear interest payment that LLDC have to make on the loan, albeit financed by the GLA. So we have a clear set of arrangements there that actually make this very clear cut.
If I could just come in on that, please, Chair. That we cost £16 million in revenue, as I understand it, roughly per annum. And in relation to the capital that we use, we are charged capital financing costs, and the price of that is £15 million per annum. So in terms of real cash, if you like, the cost to the GLA of funding LLDC could be said to be £30 million per annum. Okay. It's not £520 million per annum, it's £30 million per annum.
You've anticipated that was where my line of questioning was going. I was going to ask about the financing cost.
I mean, that's sort of what we're talking about. And I think it is fair to say, well, what are the returns that LLDC are bringing? I mentioned some of those at the beginning in terms of the counter-tax and business rates that we're driving and expect to drive by the mid-2030s. And we're in the ballpark of £200 million per annum by the 2030s. And I don't think we should forget the return to London from some of the activities that we run. So we know, don't we, that when we ran a very successful athletics event in 2017, that it made over £100 million to the London economy. We're about to run baseball. The estimates for NFL at Wembley are £16 million per football game as a return to London. These are important economic returns that we don't count in the bank balance, but they make a benefit in the round to the London economy.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable point to be making. We're going to be moving on and talking about the most exciting thing, and not the most exciting thing, one of the most exciting things coming up is, of course, the East Bank development. And we're going to have Assembly Member Berry leading on that for us.
Thank you. If I can ask about the capital part of the budget, where the East Bank has it has an income line and an expenditure line. Can I ask where the capital income from the East Bank is coming from? What comprises those numbers? Because it's quite a lot.
It is quite a lot. I think, as Rosanna might have mentioned, the partners, some of the partners bring with them significant capital income for their buildings. So some of the there are significant contributions in terms of partners' build costs. Part of the build cost is being funded by philanthropic funding. And part is being funded by government.
Yeah, so not all of that income is certain. The philanthropic funding is assumed, and that's built in each year. You're assuming you're getting some of that in.
Yeah.
The contributions from the buildings, are those effectively sort of Section 106 type contributions, or
no?
No, they're paying you to build the buildings.
Yeah.
Directly. So they're in contract, are they now, basically?
UAL is contract. Yeah.
So they're more certain.
They are.
Right.
They are. Yeah.
And in terms of the expenditure, obviously that's kind of shooting up in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
Last year it was 30 million. Next year we're planning 83, and then 186 the year after that. What does that comprise? What is that going towards?
We have currently, construction costs. Last year they would have been primarily design costs and costs. This year it's primarily design costs and costs to bring the planning application in, which has now been submitted. We are, in terms of construction, we have let 2 of the contracts. One is enabling works, and that begins shortly. One is tower cranes, that doesn't begin until the next year. And we're about to contract on substructure. So the build costs now really begin to ramp up. And that's the substantial rise over the next couple of years.
The amount that's in the 5 years has gone up, but apparently it's gone up by 10.9 million, and apparently that's because you've shifted forwards some of the works by a year. That sounds quite promising. Is that true, that things are moving faster than anticipated?
I think there has been shifts in the profile, which also we've discussed a number of profile changes result in an overall change in the borrowings requirement. I think I'm trying to remember last year's budget. I think which was done in September 2017. I think we have probably substantially reprofiled the programme since then. We're now at stage 3 of design, and as I said, we're into procurement, and we have a very tight procurement schedule over the next until really the end of next year. So I think that's just a substantial reprofiling of spend. for the programme.
Okay, and then I've been looking at the risks section of your budget, which is really useful actually. That's the sort of thing I like to see. I noticed that for the East Bank, there's a quantitative risk assessment that's been done, which again is really very useful. It values the risks in the East Bank at 63.1 million. That's what it says in the appendix, and says that planning determination is the risk that's mainly there. How do you get to that number? Just
so the quantitative risk assessment is, and I'm going to do this in a kind of my non-technical way.
Please,
it's essentially, it's a kind of assessment. All of the risks are collated and then given a probability, a max and an outcome, maximum, minimum, midpoint. And they're churned through what I call a kind of QRA black box. Essentially, it runs probability and outcomes, and the QRA is the outcome of that. So it essentially takes all of the risks that have been identified, and the teams then allocate, whether they think that's a high likelihood or a low likelihood, and then also what the outcome will be. And the QRA analysis churns that through on a number of different sort of probabilities. So currently, I think from the September forecast, the contingency is, the QRA estimate is below the contingency. So we have over 50 million of contingencies remaining, and I think probably the very latest QRA estimate is about 48 million.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really useful. And so what happens if it does then go over budget? You've got contingency for that much.
So
there must be also a remaining possibility that the risk will be higher than the midpoint in your black box.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a hill curve, and the QRAs are run every single month in more depth quarterly. So we're constantly looking at the outturn for the project, and it's there or thereabouts for a project of this size at the moment. But the point, I think, of doing the detailed risk analysis is that we can put in place mitigations. You kind of get a feeling for whether costs will be rising above what you have provisioned for earlier in the game, so that you can try and do something about them. The thing, we don't have any contingency for unknown unknowns. We'd love that, but we're not going to get that. And so currently we're sort of running within our overall, broadly within our overall forecast, our overall allocated budget.
Okay, but if planning is delayed, that would knock that up quite a lot.
So currently planning, as the report says, planning is the key risk. We've now submitted the planning application, which is good, but planning determination by May next year would eliminate a significant amount of risk in the quantitative risk assessment, because there's a significant amount allocated towards a delay and the consequences of a delay in planning. So we are working very hard with the planning teams, the development team working very hard with the planning teams to ensure that we can come out of that planning process on time, so that there won't then be any consequential delays in the programme.
Just on the planning, you are the planning authority, aren't you?
Yes.
So largely it's you putting a planning application into yourself. Would
Yeah,
there be a delay?
Well, we are subject to the GLA process as well at stage 1 and stage 2.
Yeah.
Don't forget that this is a planning approval for detailed planning for the East Bank arts and cultural buildings and the educational building, but also for residential. And so those conversations about how the residential pans out, how much affordable there is and so on, where the funding's coming from to fund the affordable, all those complex conversations are all part of the mix in terms of the planning permission that is due to be issued in May. And also we're doing this in a shorter period of time that one would normally determine such a complex application. Which puts our own planning team under stress, because a number of studies have to be run, environmental studies and so on. Good example is recently our environmental study highlighted additional wind mitigation that was required for these buildings if you've ever been on the park and walked across the main bridge there of the aquatic centre, it's quite a windy place. So we're having to consult with all of the partners individually about wind mitigation. Some of them have more than others on their buildings. There'll be some needed on the bridge. And all of these things are part of the QRA planning risk because they have potential to delay the programme. And prolongation risk is a real problem for us.
Okay, on this
It
point.
does sorry, just on this point, it does beg the question then. So I think we can take it. If there's any delays, it isn't going to come from you. Are the other people in the GLA family acutely aware that delays could cost the GLA family more money than what we need to do? And are they operating to the same timescale that you are?
They are.
They are.
We are completely joined up.
And we're not going to come back and have anything else later on.
I am
say,
totally not expecting a planning delay, but that means that we have to work hand in hand at every stage to make sure that the GLA planners are satisfied and content with what's going to be before them. And that means very close working.
Lynn, and well done if you get it, to be honest, because we'll be watching closely.
Okay. On this subject, I'm going to come to Assemblymember Shah, then we're going to go back to Assemblymember Berry. Assemblymember Shah.
Yeah, Lynn, I hear what you say about the planning process and the sort of risk involved there. But Gerry mentioned 20% contingency, which you said comes to about 50 million, isn't it, roughly, for East Bank project?
It's about 10%. The contingencies,
There's a reference here, well, you mentioned 20%, and that's what it says in the document here as well. My question is that if LLDC is responsible for overruns on construction of core and the shell only, is 20% high in terms of industry terms?
There are two things in here. One is the contingency and one is the QRA, and there are different things. Gerry.
They are. I think we are satisfied with the level of contingency. No construction project will ever say they've got enough contingency because construction is an inherently challenging and complex and risky adventure. So if I went to the construction team and said, "Would you like more contingency?"
My concern is other way around.
I think
given that, you know, because fitting out is down to the tenants, which I understand for projects of this scale and type.
For some of them.
Yeah. But then, you know, if you're only sort of liable or responsible on core and shell, does 20% justify, or is it not too high? I think it's probably on the higher side, and therefore, you know, putting greater demand on funds.
I think the contingencies have moved on since the latest contingencies figure is about 50 million, and I think that is sufficient for a project that is about to start enabling works. So I think for a project that's going into the ground, I think that's sufficient.
I'll leave it at that enough for now, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to Assemblymember Berry.
Right, so I wanted to ask about the housing projects that are going on there. And I've got quite complicated questions, so give me a moment. So basically the Mayor has imposed it on the 50% affordable housing requirement on the future developments. And the future housing developments were previously going to be directly invested by LLDC. However, this has changed since in the summer. It says in your report that the Mayor is now providing direct capital grant funding to LLDC to balance up your capital, but then also that it's becoming an equity partner in joint ventures to deliver the housing. Now, are those two things separate? Those grants are different to the separate investment that the GLA is making into these joint ventures. So that's extra, even more money coming in from the GLA.
No, it's not extra.
This.
No. So the fact
it's not coming to you, but it's more money that the GLA is spending.
No.
Is that?
No.
It's
it's all within the envelope that we've been talking about, capital-wise.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of So we, as LLDC, could enter into our own joint ventures, but it's sensible for the GLA to sit in as an investment partner rather than us do that on our own.
So on page...
But it's all the same cash, if you see what I mean. It's all the same borrowing that's being...
Yeah. So it's all within the GLA's...
Yes, yeah, because the
envelope.
GLA is our investor in any case.
So what it says on... Actually, I haven't got page numbers here, but anyway, what it says in section 7.3 of your proposal is, it says, other than professional fees relating to the early design and planning stages, the capital costs and income from these developments are no longer included within LLDC's capital plan. So in order to ask about that, we need to look at the GLA's budget instead.
Correct.
Right, okay. So we'll need to be asking for the details of those joint ventures and the money involved. That will appear in your budget.
That's right. So when we issue the consultation budget, that the GRAP element of the GLA's capital programme will set out the equity investment, if you like, of the GLA in LLDC.
And that will be its own line. It'll be easy to see and interrogate.
Well, I recall what the 21st of November Budget and Performance Committee report that the GLA did. I think it did separate that out separately, but we're constructing now the consultation document. I can make sure that we highlight that as a separate line.
Okay, and who are the joint ventures? These are going to be with people like the Transport for London, sort of the partners that are out there with the GLA.
So the joint venture will be 50% public sector, i.e. GLA as investor with LLDC, and a private partner. So there'll be, in the same way that you would normally run a development whereby you'd run a competition for a developer to come along and develop your site, we will run a competition for a joint venture partner to come along and develop the site sitting alongside us. That means that we share some of the risk in the development, but we also share the upside, and it gives us more visibility across the development.
I get the impression you're going to still be running this process then,
Yes.
and managing it. And it's just the GLAs. So you're effectively managing two partners in a joint venture, but you're not one of the partners. The LLDC is not.
Yeah, we are one of the partners, but we will be joined up with the GLA as the public sector partner.
But it's all GLA money.
Yes,
Can we just clarify? Because you're putting land in
Yes.
as part of the partnership.
Yes.
The GLA is putting money in. Can we just clarify the money it's putting in? Because to get to the 50%, is that the subsidy that we would give a developer to provide 50% affordable? Or is that, are we talking about real investment over and above the issues that you would give in terms of an housing subsidy? Are we talking about the GLA giving, really investing alongside the private sector in housing developments? What are we talking about
So
here?
there's two elements. There's the
Yes.
natural housing grant that we'd get as any developer would get, and then there is the investments that the GLA is making as part of its capital programme, which are ultimately paying for LLDC's activity. So there are those two discrete income streams.
So just because I think it's quite important to get the second one
so
again.
the joint venture.
So the housing grant is the bit, so in my language I say that's the subsidy for affordable housing. And then the second bit, because we know the Housing and Land Department go into it, they invest in certain schemes, a bit like pocket housing, for example, which is a revolving loan that comes back, but it's a commercial operation. So what is this exact money then? Is it a commercial venture, or is it housing money to stimulate? What are we stimulating here? I just want to understand this. Where's it come from?
So I'm sorry I'm not clear on my first answer, but there are these two discrete streams, as
Do
you
it in
say, the
baby
housing
language,
subsidy, and then there's the contributions we're making to LLDC's capital programme, which then part of that is then going through a joint venture.
Yeah.
That's not what you said. I must have misunderstood.
Maybe I misled you. In the JV, if it's a 50-50 JV, we will value the land, put the land in.
That's it,
Let's assume that's 50%.
That's your investment.
Yes. But what I'm saying is my investor is the banker that's sitting here, if you see what I mean. So when I say it's my investment, it's a GLA investment, the land. Yeah?
Well, let's keep it simple.
Yeah.
Right at the moment, so it's a joint venture.
Yeah.
The land is even though your golden shareholder is the GLA.
Yes.
I get that. It's still the LLDC's land
Yes.
that you're investing in a joint venture
Yeah.
and getting something back for it, right?
Yes.
And then the GLA is putting in some money, lots of money.
No.
Well, it's not putting in some money.
The land is the money. Let's say the land is worth 50 million.
Yeah.
The land goes in. The private sector partner also puts 50 million in.
Yes.
Yeah, in cash.
Yeah.
And that cash is used to build the development.
Okay.
And so our investment is the land.
Yeah.
Our investment. If we need more money on top of that to build the development, we'll then consider what borrowing we need to make in the market. Normally that would be private sector borrowing that the development partner would do, and there'd be a cost to that. In ordinary circumstances, we would simply sell the land to the developer for the 50 million and sit back and allow them all the control in the development. In this model, we'll be sat at the table to determine how the land comes forward and in what way. So one of the reasons we're doing it is to gain more control. It's not more costly than the figures we've got in. In other words, the 520 in our long-term plan already factors in sitting in these JV models.
And so there's no, and you're going to achieve 50%.
The extra
affordable.
investment that's coming from the mayor to get from our initial 35% affordable, which was our first model, to get to 50%. The mayor announced earlier this year that he was going to put extra grant in on and it was something like, yes, it was £10 million for the next 20 years in his announcement, which is helping with the affordable housing position. That's the differential between the 35% affordable that we had in the previous long-term plan and now 50%.
Okay. Assembly Member Berry's sort of been shut out of her own question a little bit, so I'm going to let you back in.
I was getting there. This was going to be... I think it's clear now. This is not dissimilar to what Transport for London are doing.
That's right.
Exactly.
It's very similar.
Yes.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
So no, I think we're good, and we'll have more questions about this, obviously, in things like the Housing Committee and also in the budget when we look at the GLA.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to come back to Assembly Member Duval now, and then Assembly Member Pigeon.
Well, I'm not good because it's about as clear as mud. So, so if I come along, so I just want to understand about the nature of the deals and are they good deals, and then I'm going to come in a question about contracts because of previous contracts associated with the LLDC and this building as well. So in any joint ventures, I'm quite interested, and I think you've said yourself in the past, Lynn, about contracts that have not been good contracts or you thought a bit strange.
Yeah.
So let's just go back to the issue of subsidy and I asked a question to David Luntz about how do I know I'm getting a good deal and all those issues. So I'm very clear about the joint venture. I've got a bit of land. I've got a sum of money and money that's coming in from the GLA, if you need to call it, and I've got a big private sector, hopefully with deep wallets, who's going to come in and put some money on the table. And for that, they're going to build some houses, and part of that, because the mayor quite has a desire for it, we all have a desire for it, that we want 50% affordable. Okay. I'm still unclear in terms of the relation how you answered, begun to answer the first question. Is there extra money going to go in to achieve the affordable? And if so, what is that? And how is that going to be? And how do I know I've got a good deal? I'm also thinking that if I'm an housing association that actually the private developer might bring along, they may also have some access to public funds that could help in the affordable issue.
Yeah.
So I'm then starting to think about, I'm putting the land in, I've got the GLA put in their little bit in to do X and all the rest of it. How do I know that I'm getting a good deal?
Well,
So what's the test? Do I ask you, or do I ask the Housing and Land, or do I ask you, Mr. Gallie, who, you know, you're a treasurer, in terms of where this money's going, and you've got a value for money notion, hopefully, somewhere along the lines, that you're going to tell me, yeah, this is a great deal. And all these people working hard for the GLA, whether it's the LLDC or Housing and Land, are actually giving you good value for money in the way they're spending this.
So, I mean, my understanding of the process that Housing and Land go through is that they look for the best bang for their buck of housing subsidy. And there's obviously competing schemes, competing developers for that, and they will look to allocate money to ensure that they get the best return on affordable housing, and that's the criteria that ultimately they are using. There's obviously a test for that to come through as to whether that housing subsidy then goes through at the particular level for a LLDC-led JV, and that would compete against all the other bids that David Lunce's team has.
See, my understanding is as soon as I start asking questions like that, if I'm sitting on housing committee, it's called commercial confidentiality, and I'm locked out of that conversation. But no doubt there will be some value for money test, and no doubt a JV says there is a semi-beauty competition sometimes beforehand about who you partner with.
There's a full OG competition.
Full OG
yeah. Oh,
yeah,
yes.
Don't give me full trust and confidence about OG processes in this building. I'll tell you that now, and I'll give you the benefit of the doubt because of the way that you've dealt with this committee and the way that you carried out your actions in the last year, which have been a breath of fresh air. There's no doubt about that, and we should give you a chance to tell us that. Let's go back to the contract issues and about how do we know on the contracts, given some of the contracts you've inherited, given some of the contracts we've had in this place, given some of the contracts, and I don't take much comfort at TfL in doing contracts as well, how do we know that this JV is going to be in the interest of the LLDC, the GLA family? So Lynn, take us through your process, because you seem to be the only one who seems to be on top of it and prepared to call bad contracts and not good ones. So what's your process? What's this little formula, bit of magic that you're going to bring in that may well be a shock to the rest of this organisation, the GLA family, about some of the contracts? I'd like to hear it.
If we start with development agreements and development contracts, there's an awful lot of experience in LLDC around those areas, and of course in housing and land at the GLA, and also out there in the wider boroughs. There are many development contracts that we've worked on over many years. They're pretty well honed, including joint venture contracts actually, whether they be joint venture contracts between the public and private sector, like an RSL with a builder. So on the park we have places for people in a JV with Balfour Beatty. We're not transparent on that, but it's very common to have JVs of that nature. So the builder builds the homes and the RSL looks after the management in the longer term and sells the properties. So they have that JV there. And there's another one at Chobham Manor, Taylor Wimpey and L&Q. So they have long history, lot of available commercial advice around good contracts for JV structures. So I'm not worried about that, actually. It's almost an off-the-shelf piece. This is not a unique thing.
No, it's not. You shouldn't be.
The stadium feels quite different, really. I think I wasn't here at the time. Many of us were not here. But what we have got is quite a unique development, a unique conversion project, and a pretty unique set of circumstances that it seems to me people were entering into contracts with people who were going to occupy the stadium. Before the building had finished being built, those contracts were being negotiated. So in the case of the operator, we didn't know exactly all of the finer points about how the stadium would be operated, and yet we entered into an operator contract. And it seems to me at that time, there was a lot of time pressure around. So before the building was even finished, we were bidding and securing Rugby World Cup in the building. That brings its own difficulties, I think, and sets of unique circumstances in negotiating those contracts. I wasn't there. I can't say what difficulties were being faced, but there was time pressure, a fairly unique set of circumstances. Apart from Manchester City, who are on a very long lease, I can't think of a single football club that pays a rent for a stadium, and a stadium of this nature. It's not an ordinary football stadium. It's a multi-use venue that has a lot of challenges in it for football, so that all feels quite unique, really, and I suppose I sympathise with it. I think it feels, hopefully, like a unique set of circumstances that belonged over there and that we're now having to get over.
Okay, well, last bit then. Look, and why shouldn't you have some confidence in your colleagues in doing it? But why shouldn't I be sceptical about some of your colleagues and their experience? So what I think this committee doesn't, and some of us have got knowledge of this, one of the JVs that's entered by Housing and Land is the Silvertown Quay. I understand is now presently in the High Courts. I don't think we want to see any of that sort of nonsense around in terms of anywhere near the developments that you're entering into. And I'm confident you wouldn't allow it. I hope you're going to tell us, the committee, that you wouldn't allow to be involved in something that's unclear, that's not coherent and doesn't make sense for the LDDC or the GLA family, or may end up costing us more money than we originally think, because it's not rocket science, as you said.
It isn't.
Some of these JVs. Thank you.
Okay. Assembly Member Pigeon.
My question might be too simplistic, but trying to understand this joint venture, and you're putting land in, you get private developer to put money in, you're going to have social housing, you might get a grant for that. Who is then going to own that social housing? Would it mean GLA, council housing, as it were? Would it, if a house, I'm trying to understand how you then, and then what return do you then get from the social housing element and also the private housing?
So it depends how you run the competition. So if we imagine a pure private developer comes along to bid for the competition, a Berkeley Homes, for example, or a Lend-Lease, what they would say is, I will build you those 600 homes. I can see that 200 of them are going to be affordable, and I have my partner here, L&Q, or my partner here, Places for People, who are a registered social landlord. What happens is Lend-Lease will build the properties. The partner, L&Q, purchases the affordable properties for a price, a lower price than the private properties, and that is assisted by grant or from the assisted additionally from the coffers from their own bank account as a registered social landlord, because as Len said, they have their own funds as well to put into affordable housing, and then they will run the properties and own them. The private properties would be sold on the private market.
Okay.
So that's a typical model.
And you would then get some of that sale price because you've put in the land?
We get the value of the land, and we get a proportion of the surpluses in the profits from the sale of the private properties.
So that's why a joint venture, though it's more complex, gets you more in return, because you're not just getting the price of the land, you're getting then a percentage of the sales. Absolutely,
and the risk is reduced because by the time we go to the market in a joint venture, we will already have planning for these properties. And there's a great degree of planning, of risk for developers in planning. If you present them with a scheme that's already got planning permission, there's a lot less risk in it for them, which is why as a regeneration agency, we will always secure planning first before going into the market, because then we can drive down the profit margin with the developer, because there's less risk in it for them.
So there's no plan for LLDC to either be a social landlord or to own that, or on the other side to rent out some of the privately built properties to then have an ongoing rental stream.
So in our long-term plan, we have a financial stream that assumes that some of the properties will be held for rent.
Right. So you might then keep some on these.
And the reason for that is because we've calculated that in order to pay off our borrowing in the timeliest fashion possible, it's not sensible to sell all the properties at once because of the house price inflation and how that moves over time. So the long-term model assumes that we would hold some properties for a period of time, take a revenue stream for them, which would help pay for the borrowing of building them, and then in the longer term sell them later. Now, what we have not yet determined with our GLA partners is how we hold on to those properties and in what kind of mechanism.
Yes.
In the first scheme that comes to the market, which will be Stratford Waterfront, there are none of those properties. No. It's in the later schemes that won't be in the market until after 2020. So we still need to work out a mechanism for holding assets if indeed we're going to go down that route.
Because that is one way to have that ongoing income, which could help wider things.
Well, it helps everyone. Yeah.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on again, and we've danced around it a little bit, but we're going to talk about the stadium now. Assembly Member Hall's going to lead on that.
If I've understood correctly that your relationship with West Ham has improved, I'm pleased about that. That can only be good for everybody. What kind of deficit is E20 looking at in 2019-20?
The deficit in 2019-20, the operating loss is around 16 million. I'm just going to turn to my budget page. The operating loss. The LLDC funds a number of other strands. So the LLDC funding for the stadium also includes restructuring costs, life cycle costs. Actually, there's a small amount of transformation costs still running through. So the overall funding in the capital plan is higher than the operating loss in the stadium.
What deal did you broker on the seating capacity?
Seating.
What happened there?
Yeah. So we were talking to West Ham for quite a long time on the seating capacity dispute, as you know. It ran up to the day of the hearing. We were able to agree something on the day. Now, as part of that agreement, we have signed a confidentiality agreement as part of that. And so I'm not able to tell you the detail of that today. However, Baroness Brady and I have agreed that it would be sensible, given all the questions that the Assembly have had in the past around the stadium and the financing and the seating in particular, that we should write to you jointly and set out the elements of that deal, and we are intending to do that later today. So it's taken us a little bit of time to agree the letter, but we've agreed the detail of the letter, and you should get that this afternoon.
Good, okay, thank you. What does the operator's fixed cost of 6 million actually pay for, if it's actually not for the operating days, the operating event days?
It pays for the year-round staffing of the operator, pays for year-round maintenance of the facility, security costs year-round, and utilities costs, those sorts of things. It pays for the pitch, the maintenance of the pitch, which is a really important element of any football stadium. It pays for insurances, those types of things.
Okay, you've said you're restructuring the stadium.
So before you move on from there,
Yeah,
sure. If you don't mind, you did say, I think, Lynn, in your earlier remarks, that you were going to be, I think you said earlier in the new year, you're going to be going through line by line the operator's costs.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that going to be something that is in the public domain? Is that something that we will be able to access and see? The reason I'm asking this question, it won't be unfamiliar to you. £6 million is a hell of a lot of money to spend on running a stadium. And comparatively, it's a lot of money as well. So we are particularly interested in why it's such an expensive stadium to run, and why the fixed cost is so high. So how public are we going to be able to interrogate you on your interrogation of that?
Well, you know, it was a bid process, so there was a competition run.
Look, at the outset, should I just say, I appreciate that this was a contract that was inherited, and it is a contractual line in the budget.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, contracts can be renegotiated. I think it's probably fair to say that the performance of that contract is probably not meeting everybody's expectations. So getting underneath the numbers in there is quite important.
Yeah. In terms of being examined on it?
I think it's difficult, obviously, because we're in a commercial relationship.
It's difficult without agreement of the part of the
without agreement. But I think, and indeed it came out in the discussion that we've had with West Ham, that we should seek to benchmark our costs against. As Lynn said, it's a unique stadium because it's a multifunctional stadium, but I think we should seek to try and benchmark costs.
I think, given, I mean, there have been discussions and debates here and in other places about, for example, the cost of hosting Premier League football matches in that stadium.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of discussion and debate, and figures have been adjusted subsequently to that. But we can't get away from the fact that a very large proportion of why there is a loss on those matches is because of the operator cost. And reputationally, that is hugely damaging.
It is, yeah. So our intention is to sit down with LS185 and go through those costs. I think it's probably a mixed bag. I would expect some of the operating costs to come down as a result of that, but I'm not over it yet in any detail. I think it's about sitting down with them in partnership, because it is poor reputationally both for us and for them, for people to be talking about high costs. Let's understand the costs. Let's see where we can make efficiencies. By working together, there might be capital investment that could bring returns. For example, LED lighting, bringing a revenue return over time, things like that we can sit down and discuss, that we've not really got into the meat of with the operator before now. So I think there are things that we could discuss that might be capable of being discussed here and wouldn't really expose them commercially. But I think we've got to do it together and sit down and be both really determined to make a difference.
Okay. I think we'll revisit that at some point in the new year then, after you've had the opportunity to start that. Sorry, Assemblyman Hall,
Well,
back
I
to
was
you.
going to come on to that, and I was going to say it's good that you are looking line by line, but I was actually going to ask you why that hadn't been done before, given the losses this is making.
Some work has been done before, hasn't it?
I think some work has been done before, but we're effectively in the second season now. The first football season was the 16-17 season. We're in the third season, 17-18, 18-19 season. And I think it's taken some time for us to get visibility of the costs. But now that we do have visibility of the costs, that we can now action some of the discussions about bringing them down.
Yes, because we must never forget it's taxpayers' money at the end of the day, and it's very concerning the amount that is lost. So you said you're restructuring the stadium, so what does that actually mean in practice? And after the restructuring, how much do you then assume that the stadium will lose each year?
So we have a 5-year plan in the papers that are our current estimates. They take into account 1 or 2 savings, but not significant restructuring at this point in time. Of course, restructuring is first of all, I think the first thing that LLDC did before I was in this job was to make the whole thing more streamlined in terms of the company by removing Newham from the partnership, so that we've got clear visibility, at least to a certain extent, through E20 and single ownership of that business and the stadium, which has helped. We've run a new commercial plan through a set of consultants that looks at the commercial opportunities associated with the stadium. So we've tested public opinion on the venue and so on, and done some work around the vision for the stadium itself. We've had a close look at all 3 of the onerous contracts that we're working with, and we've started making some progress in what we call restructuring, which is, for example, trying to renegotiate a better position with UK Athletics. With the football club, I think what we need to do first of all is get into a better relationship space before we can start talking about things like stadium naming rights, where they have the right to be consulted and so on, and they'll be a partner in any stadium naming rights deal. But, you know, you can't enter into a partnership with somebody who you're litigating with, frankly, and so there's been some work to do there. And then I think we will also, as I say, start looking at the operator contract and where we can make efficiencies in 2019. On naming rights, that's another commercial opportunity that we've not yet exploited. But as I say, West Ham are a partner in that. And very clearly, they have their own IP within the stadium. So we know, don't we, that we've not managed to go that alone in the past. It hasn't worked. There has to be a new route through. But before doing any of that, we have to get onto a better footing with the football club in general terms, I think.
But we talked about naming rights last time.
We did.
Months ago.
Yeah.
Every month that goes by that there's no deal,
yes,
it's actually costing money.
Yeah.
And looking at the losses, this is taxpayers' money, I say yet again, and it just seems to go on forever. When exactly are you going to nail that down? Because that is at least money coming in.
Well, I think I said last time, 2019 will be when we start looking at naming rights again. So next year.
But I think we were told, I wasn't on the committee, I think we were told a year ago that it was going to be done.
You were told it would have been done in 2018. When I came in February, I took the view that that was the wrong time commercially to try to sell naming rights with a partner who we were about to head into a 20-day trial with. I just think that, you know, you have to understand that West Ham are right in the centre of the naming rights piece. Obviously, they're running a Premier League football club. The global eyes on the stadium are coming from television and football. So it doesn't make any sense to me to try and go off and do that separately without having an aligned position. So our aim in 2019 will be to sit down and work out some sort of strategy around that.
I think it should be done as a matter of urgency. Anything that you can do to get money in to start reducing the losses has got to be.
I think with all due respect, the strategy has to be to maximise those monies in, and if that means we take another 6 months to do it, it's probably worth doing that. So
Yeah.
that's why I've held off.
I know, but I think in due respect, we should be looking at every single way to stop losing so much taxpayers' money, which just seems to go on and on and on. The budget submission says that there's no funding for the stadium beyond 22-23. So what's the plan, and how has this been discussed with West Ham?
Well, I think the discussion on budget is one with the GLA. So we've agreed a position in the budget that funds the stadium for the budget period, but we work very closely and transparently with City Hall on the stadium and with colleagues at the GLA, so they understand the issues and the pressures. And over the budget period, we will continue to look at the funding situation. I don't necessarily know that it's a discussion for West Ham. West Ham have got a contract that allows them use of the stadium, and they will be expecting that contract to be fulfilled. So it's an ongoing discussion. I think we're in a period now of 2 to 3 years of restructuring, and I think the view is that over that time we will come up with a longer term strategy for funding the stadium.
Okay.
But we have to try and, as Lynn said, we have worked through a number of sort of restructuring exercises, and we'll continue to do that. But it will take a number of years to work through.
Have you got any issues still outstanding with West Ham?
No more live issues than we had last time before you. There are no new items, I don't think. No.
Okay, I mean, last time a figure was given for how much it costs the taxpayer every time West Ham played. Baroness Brady was most upset about that because she said it was completely incorrect.
Yeah.
So have you got an up-to-date figure of what you consider it would cost?
Yeah, there was some confusion around this, so if I may just run through what was said. I came to the Assembly on the 6th of September. At that Assembly, I made reference to the Moore Stephens report and the things that were driving some of the difficulties in the stadium, including the fact that match day costs exceed the West Ham usage fee on a match-by-match basis. And that's a direct quote from the Moore Stephens report. It also talks about the lack of commerciality around the stadium, which we've just spoken about, and it talks about excessive costs that need to be tackled as well. These are the three key things that we need to deal with. And we are dealing with onerous contracts in there as well. I then, after I left the Assembly, we came back for a Budget and Performance Committee on the 28th of September. And you had asked us for some detail around the costs, so a table had been circulated the day before, and that breakdown showed a net loss of £84,000 per game. Now, when Baroness Brady came to the committee, which I think was around the 15th of October, she was talking about all of the other income that the football club is bringing. So it might be a food and beverage contribution. Actually, indeed, I think the food and beverage contribution is already in the 84. It was around the commercial income that's driven from advertising, for example. And Baroness Brady was saying, well, you ought to look at this, actually, as a net figure, after taking into account all of the other income that West Ham is bringing through advertising, sponsorship and so on. And when you do that, if you do that, it reduces it to just over £40,000 per game in terms of a delta. What that doesn't do, of course, is take into account all of the other costs associated with the stadium, like utilities, business rates and so on, that the public sector is picking up. So there are several ways of looking at this. Our position is that if you just take the match day activity in terms of costs and you just take the food and beverage contribution and the usage fee, the deficit is £84,000 per game. There are other ways of looking at it. What we're not doing there is adding in a proportion of life cycle, a proportion of the business rates, a proportion of additional utilities. So I think, you know, one can present the facts in different sorts of ways.
Lies, damn lies and statistics springs to mind, doesn't it? Couple of sweep-up questions. No, in fact, I won't ask those yet because some of them are pigeon indicated.
I don't know, I've been quoting £78,000, which I'd got from somewhere, which I've been quoting at every meeting I've been speaking at over the last few months, so it's near enough 84. I just want to pick up on the point, you said, obviously you've said a couple of times you'd reached an out-of-court settlement with West Ham. Just to be very clear, are there any outstanding legal cases with West Ham, and can you spell out what they are?
A number of cost issues. So I think disputes have been resolved, but we've not resolved around legal fees. So we're still in bits of dispute around legal fees that were associated with previous disputes that we've spoken to you about before.
Okay, so how much is in your budget around legal costs directly with West Ham? And then also, could you tell us about the potential costs relating to the FA investigation?
So, have you anticipated those?
We have provision in the forecast for we have some provision in the forecast for resolution of the FA issue, but our forecast legal costs we have reduced in the budget because on the assumption that this year's significant legal activity would reduce. I don't know how aspirational or hopeful that might have been. We do hold provisions against the outcome of some of these things that sit below the line, but they're only, you know, called into the budgets on a line by line basis as and when they are required. So that's all included in the LLDC funding for E20 that has gone into the LLDC budget.
How much is in there for legal fees or legal costs associated with West Ham, and how much associated with the FA investigation?
I think in terms of the forecast this year, we have about 54,000 in relation to the FA charge currently in the forecast. I don't have a separate forecast. I don't have a forecast for next year's legal fees split by West Ham or other. I've got a general
because I think last when you came before us, Lynn, you talked about 4 million off the top of my head that it cost you in legal fees, which I was quite astonished by. So I'm just wondering what provision is there just to tidy off those remaining challenges and disputes?
The 4 million related to the forecast fees, legal fees for West Ham disputes for the 3 years ending 18-19.
So 3 years, yeah.
So that was a 3-year forecast a forecast to the end of the current year. We have revised the forecast, as indeed we wrote shortly after the hearing, and we have revised that forecast, and the forecast for West Ham related disputes over the last 3 years ending in March 18 is around 5 million. That includes increased cost on the capacity case. Over the summer and the autumn, we were in court constantly on the capacity case in relation to additional disclosure requirements or actions, and also in relation to expert witness reports that came in late. Our experts had to attend to that. So the capacity case, notwithstanding that it was settled and we saved the court costs, which were substantial at about 400,000, the overall capacity court case costs we estimate to be about 3.6 million in total over the last 3 years. There are other, as we mentioned, that we've been in court defending 2 actions, 2 injunctions, and there's been from West Ham in relation, one to the FA charge and the other to LEDs, and that has also caused the overall costs to increase.
And as a result of the FA investigation, there's a potential that you're going to need extra stewarding. Who would bear that cost? Would that be the stadium operator, so LS 185, or would it be West Ham, or would it be ultimately LLDC?
We pick up the cost of the extra stewarding. So we're very unlikely, the adjudication is unlikely to say we would need extra stewards on top of where we are today. But immediately following the Burnley game on the 10th of March last year, we put additional stewarding in place for the last 5 games of the season. And for the whole of this season, we've had additional stewarding as well. And there's been additional policing as a result. So the categories of the games have been shifted so that there are more police around in the stadium, in and around the stadium, and so on. And it depends on the category of the game, the level of stewarding we put in. But it's been significantly higher ever since the Burnley game. The cost of that is picked up directly by LLDC. But we are in the hands of the operator in terms of the statutory safety officer making a determination of the appropriate level of stewarding in conjunction with other safety experts at the safety advisory group that meets before every single football game.
Okay, lovely, thank you for clarifying that.
Okay, so just a couple of tidying up questions. On the naming rights, you said entirely reasonably that West Ham are a key partner in that. You can't really do it without West Ham. Most naming rights deals for a sports stadia are aligned with the naming rights on the shirt sponsor. Obviously West Ham already have their own shirt sponsor.
Yes.
When does their deal expire?
I'm not sure actually. I think we thought it had been renewed this year for at least a temporary period of time.
And does that have a material impact on any plans you might have for the stadium? I'm imagining it does.
It may do, yes, yeah.
Okay.
They tend to be 3 or 5 year deals, so they're not extremely long, whereas a stadium naming rights would tend to be 10 years plus.
Yeah, which is how you maximise the leverage.
Yeah.
So, okay, we'll watch the space on that one. You mentioned earlier on baseball in the stadium, and there is much excitement about it. Obviously, selling out in minutes is good. The query that has been made in numerous sources is around the cost of doing that. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah. So what we're not at liberty to do is talk about the commercial fee for baseball. It's a trial, of course, for London. We've entered into a 2-year deal, 2019, 2020. They bring a complete overlay of their own into the stadium, and they pay us a commercial fee for hiring the stadium, essentially. We will have to do additional seat moves to accommodate baseball. If you recall, we've had a conversation about seat moves before, whereby we limited the seat moves last year, this year for athletics, and therefore saved quite a lot of money. We have to do some additional seat moves in order to accommodate baseball. But when we look at the commercial fee and the food and beverage, it will make a surplus for the stadium.
So the hosting the baseball in the Olympic Park is not going to be a cost to anybody, not to the taxpayer.
It's not, no.
Okay. The other thing that you might want to talk about is the deal that you've done with UK Athletics about the certainty in fixing dates for the next 6 years. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah. So UK Athletics have a athletics window that starts at the beginning of July and ends at the beginning of August. One of the key parts of their contract that was causing us a bit of difficulty was around the seats. So all of the onus to move the seats to suit athletics was on E20. And so this year, in 2018, when officers managed to negotiate a modified seating position, I mean, due to fantastic flexibility from UKA, they agreed with us a new manifest. It meant that we saved a considerable amount of money, about £6 or 7 million pounds, from not moving seats in the way we had to do for the 2017 World Championships.
Yep.
But we are in contractual terms that's subject to their agreement. It was quite important to us to change the contract so that we were allowed to change the seats by consulting them, indeed, but that the decision to change the seats was with us as long as their sight lines were protected and they could get the athletics away in a decent format so everybody could enjoy the days. And so it's important to us that we're able to consolidate, if you like, that position for those savings into the future. And the other key part of the deal is around fixing their events. So obviously we're trading things in something like this, and what they really wanted was a fixed date for their event. So that at the moment they have to wait until 6 months before they run an athletics event for us to finally confirm that they can run the event and the date of the event. So with them having a fixed date, they can now enter into longer term commercial arrangements. They can enter into arrangements with television and BBC and so on in terms of screening things. And they can enter into arrangements with commercial partners that have a longevity for them. So in return for the flexibility around the seats, they've got a longer sponsorship arrangement. They've got one fixed event per year that's on a fixed weekend, which will be the third weekend in July. And there will be potentially a second event, but that one is subject to our discretion. It's intended to be the second weekend in July at the moment, but at our discretion, we may ask UKA to move that event to a different window, different weekend. The flexibility that gives us is it allows us to get ready sooner for football at the end of the month, and at the beginning of the month, when we settle the stadium down, it will potentially enable us to commercialise the early weekends, perhaps by holding a concert in the first weekend of July or some such thing. There are one or two exceptions, so we've had to protect World Cup football, which I think is 2022. Which means that football might change in terms of the dates in the stadium, and football has primacy in the stadium above everything else. And secondly, we've had to protect the first week in July for UKA for the Tokyo Games in 2020, because clearly they need to run the athletics sooner in July in order so the athletes can be ready for the Tokyo Games, if that makes sense. So that's in essence the deal that we've done. So it's basically more flexible for us, more certainty for them, gives us an opportunity to commercialise later.
Okay, that sounds quite reasonable. Unless any member has any other questions, we've reached the end of our session with you, so can I thank you very much for your time. Members, can we note the contents of the discussion? I'm going to adjourn the meeting for 2 or 3 minutes so that we can sort out the nameplates and invite our second set of guests to come down. You are of course free to stay, but I suspect you might not.
Thank you.
GLA, Chamber, Sound. 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 GLA, chamber, sound.
To look at the draft budget for the OPDC, so can I thank our guests for attending in order. Doug Wilson, the Chief Operating Officer, Liz Peace, the Chair, Mick Mulhern, who's the Interim Chief Executive, and of course David Gallie, who as always on these occasions is ever present. Thank you very much for your attendance. We're going to kick off by having a look at the capital spend, which is obviously changing quite significantly, and Assemblymember Cooper is going to lead on that for us.
So the first question, and I'm very happy with whoever might want to answer this, but possibly Doug, is who is going to pay for all of the capital investment that you've got lined up?
Well, we hope that most of it's going to be paid for by the Housing Infrastructure Fund.
Most of it?
Most of it. What we've done, to recap, is to bid for 250 million, which is the maximum we're permitted to bid for, in order to kickstart development at Old Oak North. The plan in broad terms is that 250 million is used to assemble land and begin to design and build infrastructure. I say begin because the 250 million won't cover the entire cost.
Well, that's why my question was who's going to pay for it, and I said, oh, the HIF is going to pay for it, because my understanding was that there's a little bit of a gap here between total cost and the money that you've...
Yeah, because the land we purchase with the HIF money will then be sold and the uplift recycled into paying for further infrastructure. And that's the explanation for the 237 million gap between grant funding of one sort or another and the cost of the land and infrastructure.
So supposing there's a bit of a slowdown and there's actually no uplift between when you purchase and when you sell, in fact, there's a sort of decline potentially in...
Well, what we're expecting to experience is uplift as a result of the HIF injection, because the issue there is a market failure where the development won't come forward without some strategic infrastructure being introduced, but that in itself is expected to generate a significant increase in land values.
Okay, so you're relying on the HIF coming in, and the fact that that has arrived is going to increase the land values in the area of the OPDC, regardless of what else might be going on in the property market across the rest of London or the whole of the country.
I mean, perhaps I can just intervene here. I think it would be inconceivable that the amount of infrastructure that we're going to put in with that initial 250 million from the HIF would not have quite an impact on surrounding values. I mean, I think the world would practically have to come to an end without something happening there. Now, look, it's going to be variable and we can't predict precisely, but if you look at even the years of the worst recession in London, you know, house prices and values do come back. We're looking at this over a relatively long period of time. So I am very confident that by injecting £250 million worth of infrastructure, which is going to be building roads, bridges, tunnels, energy centres, other infrastructure, that will make the values much higher in the land around it. It will also enhance the values of the land beyond our initial phase, our northern wedge, which will facilitate future development by the private owners of that land.
I suppose my concern is just that if we're going to see that money coming in and it's going to be used for land acquisition and land assembly, that it might be tied up in that and then not available to be used in actually creating the infrastructure as well.
Well, we've split it out sufficiently between between the acquisition of the land and indeed the build of the initial phase of the infrastructure. Mick wants to talk about the phasing of that.
I think there's a couple of points maybe in your question. I think the first one for me is we will use housing infrastructure funding to build a new street that will open up Old Oak North and allow public transport, private vehicles, walking and cycling through Old Oak North. It will put in the necessary utilities, energy centres, electrical stations, water, drainage, all those kind of... So that's HIF will fund the delivery of that key strategic infrastructure. In addition, the HIF funding will allow us to assemble enough land to be able to bring forward directly in the region of about 2,000 to 3,000 new homes with about 2,000 or so, enough employment space for around about 2,000 jobs. And that investment, we've, with our team, have tested various different scenarios of growth levels, house price increases at a big level, at a low level, changes to construction costs, changes to availability of skills and labour, and have tested those pieces through our business case work. And we've packaged that information with various different sensitivity tests in there and have submitted that to MHCLG. And we've spent the last, since the 10th of September, working with central government to answer a whole raft of further questions about, well, what happened if this happened and what happens if that happened? And we provide all of that information to them. We've got to the point where there are no more outstanding questions. We've given them all the information that they want. And I think we're now at the point where we feel like we've demonstrated the case. It's been done prudently, and we're now waiting for a kind of a political decision to be taken as to whether or not that the funding.
That brings me on to my next point. We're talking about this all going ahead. You've assured me that you've done all of the necessary sensitivity analysis on both the cost side and also the income side with lots of different scenarios. But we're talking about it as if we definitely know that the 250 million is coming from the HIF. You've just all shaken your heads and said no.
So sadly, we don't definitely.
We don't definitely know. So what happens? What happens if it? When will we know? What happens if it doesn't come?
Well, we were hoping we would have heard by the time we sat in front of you. Unfortunately, there seem to be a few other things going on in central government.
No idea what those
No
could
idea
be.
I'm not
Twiddling their thumbs.
No idea. The what happens if we don't? Well, there are two issues. One, we may not hear for a while if indeed government becomes preoccupied with other things. If there is an election, change of government, whatever, and we have to cope with that uncertainty for another few months. And my view, and I think that of the rest of the board, is that we have to carry on planning for a good outcome. Because if we don't, if we stop planning and we do get a good outcome, we'll have lost too much time to be able to deliver within the time frame for actually spending the HIF money. So I think we've got to take that risk. I think that is a sensible one. If we don't get it at all, then we're into an interesting and different ball game. As Doug said, this site is really subject to a significant market failure. It is very difficult to see how you could actually kickstart good quality development within a sensible time scale without some injection of funding. So we would have to go back to the drawing board and look at other possibilities if we don't get the HIF bid. But we have not been given let's put it positively, We have been given every indication that MHCLG likes our bid. They can't give us certainty one way or another, but they haven't been telling us it's a terrible bid, we're barking up the wrong tree, we shouldn't get it. So we are hopeful we will get a favourable outcome, but we can't absolutely guarantee.
So to sum it up then, they haven't said yes, they haven't said no, they've given some positive indications that you have satisfied all of their questions about what you've submitted, that you've done the work to prove to them that the bid, if it is successful, would create success.
Yeah.
We still have no idea when we might hear from them, when the money might be forthcoming.
No, I mean if we hear from them, we would hope. Well, there is a very limited timescale for actually spending the money, so it would become self-defeating if they let it drag on for another 6 months or something like that. I mean, I pluck that time out of the air. I have no idea, and I don't think any of us do at the moment.
Right, so there is a point at which the delay becomes impossible.
Well, it would become impossible to actually spend the money.
To spend the money in the time
within the
available.
time scale that they have stated, yes.
So is there any possibility, and I think this one is probably now for David Gallie, that the GLA might need to put in direct funding? I mean, there was a 200 million sort of revolving housing loan set up that we explored with James Murray's housing team. This is relatively a similar amount. Is there any chance of that, or a grant that's not going to come back? Could that happen?
Well, as the others have said, we'd obviously hope to get the HIF bid through as soon as possible. If there is any cost overrun beyond the March 23 date, then the GLA has to meet that liability. So that's for us exactly why we are very supportive of OPDC's proposals, that they carry on now on the assumption that they will be successful, because the potential cost for the GLA of delay, but if we down tools now, would be prohibitive. If the government were to follow Liz's indicative timeline in 6 months' time, then I think we'd look to try and renegotiate the March 23 deadline to ensure that there's a feasible plan that OPDC could spend the money in time to avoid that liability.
Government's been talking a lot about deadlines, but not recently been talking about extending them, but I think that is in a different context. What happens if you don't get the whole of the 250 million and they say, yes, we do like the bid, and they tell you next week, but you can only have, 175 or 200 million? Is that still enough to play with, to go forward with, to achieve success?
I think I think the question is what we've done through the exercises demonstrate why that 250 million, but why it's that figure, and why that figure is that right level of public investment to then free up the private sector coming in to deliver the rest of it. So effectively, we've demonstrated that that's the case that we've put forward, and that's the case that officials in government who, when they've asked those questions, have given those kind of positive indications that that's a credible proposition, but no decisions. So the answer at this stage, the recommendation isn't to fund less. The view is it's this package, or take a decision on not funding it. So there isn't a position where somebody at this point comes back and says we'll give you half the amount of money. That's not what the discussion has been around. So that would be very unlikely that would happen.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just follow up on the consequences of project delays and all the rest of it? It's a Crossrail delayment. I think you spoke at the Assembly before in answer to one of my colleagues' questions around HS2. What does the delays of Crossrail impact on your work then? Are there any? Maybe none at all.
No, the limited to nothing, I would say. In effect, the Crossrail station at Old Oak will be built as part of a single high-speed 2 station with Great West Main Line, Crossrail and high-speed 2. So that station isn't due to open until 2026.
We hope Crossrail might have opened before then.
You still stand by...
No guarantee of that.
Sorry, I was just, giving you the chance.
And you still stand by your answer in terms of it really didn't matter about HS2 because Crossrail is going to happen? Because that's what I think you both said to my colleague on the
Sorry,
Assembly.
I missed the first part of that question. You remind me what I said about
It's
HS2.
the impact. I think you said it, I'll go through. I think you started with gosh. Crossrail is going through the site, whatever happens, that is there.
Yeah.
We have a terrific infrastructure as well as HS2. This is a huge area of land with potential to deliver the sort of housing and jobs that London needs.
Right, yes.
And you think that's still the
I'd
case?
stand by all of that, and I think I would take the view that, were HS2 not to happen, and nobody suggested to me that it wouldn't, you could still see this as a whole sort of new town development for the northwest of London, because frankly it's got terrific infrastructure that you could open up anyway, particularly something like Willesden Junction, which could be an ingress to the site from the north as opposed to HS2 from the south. Having both, great, but I think you could still make it a viable site.
And then, given already that we've seen the impact of one aspect of Brexit in terms of delaying possibly the answer whether you get the government grant or not, how confident you are in terms of your delivery plans of surviving the well, not a mini, well, could be a mini recession, could be an impact of Brexit, confidence that go through. Where's your thinking about that on this particular scheme, if it impacts in terms of that and its survivability? Do you go back to square one on some issues, or what? What's your thinking about that? Because that must impact about that budget gap that in answering my colleague's earlier question.
So I think we, as part of preparing our business case, and the financial modelling and the economic modelling that you do as part of that, and the multiple scenarios that you run with different levels of growth and different levels of price increases and construction costs, we test that. Our big infrastructure, for example, includes 66% optimism bias, considering where we are in the design cycle at the moment, and that's a figure that you do to take account of multiple stages in an economic cycle so that it's resilient, considering where we are and the amount of time it will take us to build this out. This is a 15-year programme. The economy will go up and down during that period of time. And as I said previously, we believe that the scenarios that we've tested, the levels that we've pitched at, we believe are quite prudent in terms of being able to weather the ups and downs in the economy, which will happen over the next 15, 20 years.
Okay.
I mean, I guess, Mr. Duval, you were hinting at the possibility that the government might, scrap the whole HIF bid if things got really bad over the next 6 to 12 months. Well, we'd have to go back to the drawing board and look at what was feasible. We've, as Mick said, we've done a huge amount of contingency planning, but I think if we get to a real Armageddon scenario, we won't be the only people, having to do quite a lot of rethinking. I suspect the GLA might as well, generally.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on and talk about revenue funding. Assembly Member Shah?
Yeah, well, as a local assembly member, as well as from regeneration perspective, I certainly very much welcome that OPDC is now gearing up towards the beginning of the project in the earnest. I want to pick up issues about revenue funding, revenue spending, actually. Can you explain what exactly will you use the extra 3 million revenue funding on?
Okay, well, I will let Mick go into the detail, Mick and Doug go into the detail of that, but I mean, in broad terms, we are going to be gearing up to deliver a £250 million programme. So we need some extra people to do it, and we need extra consultancy support. Now, we're very keen to keep what we describe as a thin client model. We're not going to be building up hundreds and hundreds of staff. We will need to appoint a delivery partner, but basically it's funding our running of the expanded programme.
No, I appreciate that, but I want to know, what this extra 3 million spend is going to be about. Doug,
So it's client-side management of the project. It's split broadly between 1.6 million for around about 17 to 18 additional staff, who will be project managers, directors responsible for land assembly, and another 1.4 million of costs for services, legal advice, consultancy fees. All of these are ones that we consider cannot be capitalised and therefore charged against the HIF funding. Where possible, we will capitalise costs, and indeed we believe 3 of the staff posts totalling 300,000 can be capitalised, but the others will be revenue costs to give us the management capacity to ensure that we control the programme very closely and make sure we do come in on budget.
Is this, I mean, is there an element of risk here in terms of expanding the team? I mean, I appreciate what you said in terms of management capacity, etc. In the light of the Housing Infrastructure Fund, which is still not guaranteed. I know you're hopeful about it, but there's still that risk involved.
Absolutely. We have no intention of expanding without the HIF announcement, so it's not that we're motoring full speed ahead to add 18 members of staff to our establishment. That will be dependent on a HIF announcement.
Okay. Right, we're speeding through this. We're going to our final section now, which is about your land deals, and some member of the Val is going to lead on that.
Thank you very much. So we've got, as we understand it, in terms of our briefing note, there's a new approach in terms of how you've done the land deals, and in particular how you're dealing with Network Rail. And so it's a joint evaluation approach and those issues. So do you want to just tell us generally what the progress you've made on the land valuation exercise per se, and then we might drill down a little bit further.
I'll start because this was a subject sort of very close to my heart when I took over the job, because as you know, we had an MOU with the Department for Transport, and in broad terms, the MOU allowed us to acquire public sector land, which was effectively Network Rail land, at existing use value with the potential for some sharing of the upside. There had been much debate about whether and how this land deal was either sensible or deliverable, and I'm delighted to say that we've actually got to the stage now where DfT have permitted or instructed Network Rail to get on and negotiate with us over the existing use value, and this is what the chaps have been doing for the last 3 months. We've made excellent progress on that. There's still further work to be done looking at potential upside revenue share, depending on whether there is any upside on that particular those particular sites in the future. But we have been delighted that we've effectively sort of secured the terms of the MOU on the key sites for the development of the northern phase of the project. So if you want to talk details.
No, I think
sorry, and the key to that, because I think it's quite an important success and achievement, is to stop the fragmentation disposal by Network Rail.
And indeed, yes, absolutely right. And Network Rail have played this very straight, very honestly. They have seen off other people who've been trying to sort of nibble away at this land and press them into selling it to them. So we are pleased that we have such a good working relationship and a good, so far, a good outcome to the negotiations. Yet to be firmed up, but it looks
that's
okay.
where you are. Midway through negotiations,
so
towards the end.
The point that you made about joint valuations, that work is complete, and I think the next stage, as Liz has intimated, is that we will need to consider as part of a wider package of agreements. So, for example, not only do we need to secure land, but we will also need to build pieces of infrastructure over railway lines and under railway lines, and with that, we need to be absolutely certain that if we agree a price for a particular piece of land, that we're then not held captive to delivering and paying over the odds for a piece of infrastructure that goes under a railway line, for example. So it's important that there's a package of agreements with Network Rail put in place across all those things, because we don't want to just secure the land, we also want to secure the rights to be able to build infrastructure that lands on those sites.
And also it would give government more confidence if you got that negotiation done about if it was you versus another project in some of that funding or not. So when do we, not wishing to put, a sort of the final date on it, what sort of timescale are we talking about to conclude those negotiations? What would you think is reasonable to do those package of quite important issues?
Yeah, so as I said, the existing use value on the land has already been a piece of work that's completed. Through our land assembly process at the moment, which is looking at not just Network Rail, but also land that's owned by freehold owned by Hammersmith and Fulham, land that's freehold owned by Car Giant, and there's multiple other interests in there. We've got to work across all of that land to figure out, not just Network Rail. So there's a process in there is a programme, but this is a 12-month piece of work effectively that we've got to refine and work out over that period of time. So there's a programme and it's about a year or so. It could be longer to kind of work through all of that.
But the importance of going through that process on that Network Rail is to unblock maybe some of those other negotiations.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, to get that in there. Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, Assemblyman Pigeon.
A slightly random question. The answer may well be no, but I know Transport for London are looking at moving Victoria Coach Station when its lease comes to an end. I know they're looking at a number of sites. Have they approached you at all to see if they could use some of your land, given you're going to be so well connected to the Crossrail when it eventually opens and tubes, so people could get there and be already part way out of London?
Yeah, I think the general point is that we're going to be an incredibly accessible site. So as part of TfL looking at all options, we did have a conversation with them, given how accessible Old Oak will be, and it was identified as a site that had great potential. And as I understand it, it is one of the long-listed sites at the moment, but we're not having detailed discussions with TfL about the potential for Victoria Coach Station to come to Old Oak.
No, I mean, they're assessing sites. I think they're going to report back in December, but there's the potential you could end up with a new Victoria Coach Station as part of your site.
So, as I said, all I know is that we were on the long list. They came and spoke to us. But we're not on any short list because we haven't been part of.
But what was your response? Was it positive to this, or we don't want this?
Yeah,
or
no.
not?
I mean, from our perspective, if it works and doesn't impact on our ability to deliver our objectives, which are 25,000 homes and 65,000 jobs, if we can deliver that and make Old Oak even more accessible, then that would be something we would support. But there would be a whole lot of work to understand how you put a coach station into Old Oak in terms of its impact on the wider transport network, its ability to deliver a great place, and that's not because TfL aren't looking at Old Oak as a site yet at the moment. Then that's a level of detail that we never got into.
It's on a long list, and you potentially would welcome it and work with them on it if it could stack up.
Well, I think that I was going to say, I think the point is, yes, we'd be very happy to discuss the details of it. We certainly didn't say no, go away.
Yeah.
So we would be happy to talk to them.
Okay, thank you.
I feel a bit guilty because you had to wait for a while for this, but we've actually finished our questioning of you today. So thank you very much indeed for your attendance and for your answers. If we do have subsequent queries, we may well write to you for them.
Okay, thank you very much.
Members, can we agree to note the report in today's discussion? This will take just a moment. If you don't mind waiting just for a second, we'll speed through this in literally seconds. Item 5, members, is the Budget and Performance Committee work programme. Can we agree the work programme for the remainder of the year? Thank you. Item 6 is the date of the next meeting, as discussed previously. The date of the next meeting will be Monday, the 7th of January 2019 at 2 o'clock in here, and we'll be looking at Transport for London's budget submission. Item 7, any other business I consider urgent? There is none, so the meeting is closed.
GLA